Joshua, the son of Nun, stands as one of the most remarkable figures in biblical history. His life was marked by unwavering faith, courage, and absolute obedience to God. While he is best known for leading the Israelites into the Promised Land and bringing down the walls of Jericho, his story encompasses far more: a journey of divine encounters, miraculous victories, and steadfast devotion to God's commands. Born into slavery in Egypt, Joshua witnessed firsthand the suffering of his people under Pharaoh's rule. He experienced the hardships of bondage, yet he also saw God's power and faithfulness when Moses, under divine guidance, led the Israelites out of Egypt. These early experiences shaped Joshua's character, instilling in him a deep reliance on God and a firm belief in His promises. From the very beginning, Joshua demonstrated qualities of leadership and loyalty. His name, which means Yahweh is salvation, foreshadowed the divine mission he would later fulfill. He quickly emerged as one of Moses' most trusted assistants, proving himself to be dependable, courageous, and faithful. Unlike many others in his generation who doubted God, Joshua stood strong in his trust. His faith set him apart, preparing him for the monumental task ahead. Joshua first stepped into a leadership role during the battle against the Amalekites, Exodus 17, despite having no formal military training. He led Israel's army to victory with God's help, proving his ability to trust in divine intervention. This event was a turning point, revealing his potential as a warrior and a man of great faith. Perhaps one of the most defining moments in his early life came when he was selected as one of the 12 spies sent to scout the land of Canaan. While the other spies feared the fortified cities and giants, Joshua and Caleb remained steadfast, believing that God would deliver the land into their hands. Their faith pleased God, securing Joshua's role as a future leader. Joshua's story is one of faith, resilience, and divine purpose. From a humble beginning as a slave to becoming the leader of Israel, his journey reminds us that God often prepares His chosen leaders through trials, shaping them for a greater calling. Joshua's early life was shaped by hardship, faith, and divine preparation. Born into the tribe of Ephraim during Israel's darkest years of slavery in Egypt, he grew up witnessing the cruelty of Pharaoh's rule and the suffering of his people. Though little is known about his family, Joshua experienced firsthand the weight of oppression, forced labor, and the longing for freedom. These early trials built within him a deep resilience and a firm trust in the God of Israel, who had promised deliverance to His people. As a young man, Joshua watched in awe as God sent Moses to confront Pharaoh and perform mighty miracles, culminating in the plagues and the night of the first Passover. When the Israelites were finally freed and crossed the Red Sea on dry ground, Joshua saw the undeniable power of God in action. These events laid the foundation for his unwavering faith. Unlike many of his peers who later doubted and rebelled against God, Joshua remained steadfast, learning to trust in divine leadership. During the Israelites' journey through the wilderness, Joshua's natural abilities as a leader began to emerge. His first recorded act of leadership occurred during the battle against the Amalekites at Rephidim, Exodus 17. Without formal military experience, he was chosen by Moses to lead an army of former slaves against a battle-hardened enemy. The victory was not due to Israel's strength, but to God's intervention, reinforcing Joshua's faith that success comes through reliance on the Lord. Beyond the battlefield, Joshua demonstrated spiritual devotion and humility. When Moses ascended Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments, Joshua accompanied him part way, waiting patiently while the Israelites below fell into idolatry, Exodus 24:13. His loyalty to Moses and separation from the people's rebellion reflected his strong moral character and dedication to God. Joshua's faith was further tested when he was selected as one of the 12 spies sent to scout Canaan, Numbers 13. While 10 spies spread fear and doubt, Joshua and Caleb remained resolute, urging the people to trust in God's promise. Their faith set them apart, preserving their lives while an entire generation perished in the wilderness. Through trials, victories, and unwavering devotion, Joshua was being shaped for the monumental task ahead, leading Israel into the Promised Land. Joshua's journey to leadership was not sudden. It was a process of preparation, testing, and faithfulness. As Moses' closest assistant, he spent years observing the immense responsibility of leading a rebellious and often ungrateful nation. During this time, Joshua learned valuable lessons in humility, patience, and complete dependence on God. His unwavering loyalty to Moses and his steadfast faith in God set him apart as a natural leader, ready to step into the role that awaited him. One of Joshua's most defining moments came when he was chosen as one of the 12 spies sent to scout the land of Canaan, Numbers 13. While the majority of the spies returned with fear-filled reports about the giants and fortified cities, Joshua and Caleb stood firm in their belief that God would fulfill his promise. They declared with confidence that the land was good and that, with God on their side, Israel could conquer it. However, their faith was met with opposition, and the people rebelled against Moses and God. As a result, an entire generation was condemned to perish in the wilderness, while only Joshua and Caleb were granted the privilege of entering the Promised Land. Throughout the 40 years of wandering, Joshua continued to serve as Moses' assistant, witnessing firsthand how God guided, disciplined, and provided for his people. He saw the consequences of Israel's disobedience, but he also experienced God's mercy and faithfulness. Unlike many of his peers, Joshua's trust in God never wavered. He remained patient, knowing that God's timing was perfect. When the time came for Moses to pass the mantle of leadership, God himself commanded that Joshua be appointed as the next leader of Israel. Numbers 27:8-18. In a public ceremony, Moses laid his hands on Joshua, symbolizing the transfer of authority. God reassured Joshua with the same promise he had given Moses. "Be strong and courageous, for I will be with you." This divine endorsement not only solidified Joshua's leadership, but also signaled a new chapter in Israel's history. Joshua's rise to leadership was not about ambition or personal gain. It was about faith, obedience, and God's calling. He was chosen, prepared, and strengthened for the monumental task of leading Israel into the Promised Land. As the Israelites stood on the brink of the Promised Land, a significant transition in leadership took place. Moses, the great prophet and leader who had guided Israel out of Egypt and through the wilderness, was nearing the end of his life. The responsibility of leading the nation into their divine inheritance would now fall on Joshua. This was not a mere political shift, but a divinely orchestrated moment that reaffirmed God's promises and established Joshua as the leader chosen to fulfill them. Joshua had spent years as Moses' assistant, watching and learning the immense challenges of leadership. He had seen Moses intercede for the people, endure their complaints, and lead them with wisdom and patience. Unlike many of his peers who had perished in the wilderness due to their lack of faith, Joshua had remained steadfast in his trust in God. His time of preparation was now over, and God was ready to place him at the head of the nation. Recognizing the weight of this transition, Moses sought God's guidance in appointing his successor. In Numbers 27:18, 2 verses 23, God clearly instructed Moses to commission Joshua, describing him as a man in whom is the Spirit. This divine affirmation made it clear that Joshua's leadership was not based on human ambition or personal qualifications, but on God's calling. In a public ceremony before the entire assembly of Israel, Moses laid his hands on Joshua, symbolizing the transfer of authority. The people now knew that Joshua was God's chosen leader. God himself reassured Joshua with a powerful command that would echo throughout his life. "Be strong and courageous, for you will bring the Israelites into the land I swore to give them, and I myself will be with you." Deuteronomy 31:23. These words were a reminder that success would not depend on military strength or personal ability, but on complete reliance on God. With this divine mandate, Joshua's leadership journey began. He was stepping into the role not just as a military commander, but as a spiritual leader, entrusted with fulfilling God's covenant. His task was monumental, but he was ready, because God was with him. With Joshua now established as Israel's leader, the time had come for the nation to take their first step into the land God had promised them. Their journey had led them to the banks of the Jordan River, a natural barrier standing between them and Canaan. At that time, the river was at flood stage, making the crossing seem impossible. Yet, just as God had parted the Red Sea for Moses, he was about to demonstrate his power once again, this time through Joshua. God gave Joshua specific instructions for the crossing. The priests were to carry the Ark of the Covenant, which represented God's presence, and step into the river. As soon as their feet touched the water, the river would stop flowing, allowing the Israelites to cross on dry ground. This moment was not just about moving from one place to another. It was a test of faith and a confirmation of Joshua's leadership. With complete trust in God's command, Joshua relayed the instructions to the people. He called on them to consecrate themselves, preparing spiritually for the miracle that was about to unfold. As the priests stepped into the water, the raging river miraculously stopped flowing, piling up in a great heap upstream. The riverbed became dry, and the entire nation of Israel crossed over safely. This miraculous event was a clear sign that God was with Joshua just as he had been with Moses. It reinforced to the Israelites that their victories would not come from human effort but through divine intervention. After the crossing, Joshua commanded 12 men, one from each tribe, to take stones from the riverbed and set them up at Gilgal as a memorial. This monument was to serve as a reminder for future generations of how God had miraculously led his people into the Promised Land. The crossing of the Jordan was more than a logistical achievement. It was a spiritual milestone. It marked the beginning of a new era for Israel, a transition from wandering to possessing, from promise to fulfillment. Under Joshua's leadership, Israel was now ready to take the land God had given them. After crossing the Jordan River, the Israelites faced their first major challenge in the Promised Land: the fortified city of Jericho. With its towering walls and strong defenses, Jericho was considered impenetrable. To conquer this city would require more than military strategy. It would demand complete faith and obedience to God. Joshua, as Israel's leader, was about to experience firsthand how God fights for his people. Before the battle began, Joshua had a divine encounter. As he approached Jericho, he saw a man with a drawn sword standing before him. When Joshua asked if he was for Israel or their enemies, the man replied, "Neither, but as commander of the Lord's army I have now come." Joshua 5:14. Realizing he was in the presence of the divine, Joshua fell to the ground in reverence. This encounter reaffirmed that the battle ahead was not Joshua's alone. God was in command. Rather than using traditional military tactics, God gave Joshua an unusual strategy. The Israelites were to march around the city once a day for 6 days in complete silence, except for the sound of the priests blowing trumpets. On the 7th day they would march around the city 7 times, and at Joshua's command they would shout. At that moment, God promised the walls of Jericho would collapse, giving Israel total victory. Though the plan defied human logic, Joshua and the Israelites obeyed without hesitation. For 6 days they marched as instructed, trusting in God's promise. On the 7th day, after completing the final lap, the priests blew their trumpets, and Joshua commanded the people to shout. At that moment, the massive walls of Jericho crumbled to the ground, allowing the Israelites to charge into the city and conquer it completely. This miraculous victory was not just a military triumph, it was a spiritual lesson. It demonstrated that true success comes through faith and obedience to God, not human strength. The fall of Jericho set the tone for the rest of Israel's conquest, proving that as long as they trusted in God, no obstacle would stand in their way. After the miraculous victory at Jericho, Joshua led the Israelites in a series of military campaigns to conquer the rest of the Promised Land. The conquest was not merely a matter of territorial expansion, it was the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. Each battle required not only military strategy, but also unwavering faith in God's guidance. Joshua's leadership, combined with divine intervention, secured Israel's dominance over the land. Following Jericho, the Israelites faced a setback at Ai due to disobedience within the camp. After dealing with the sin of Achan, who had taken forbidden plunder, Joshua led a renewed attack and successfully captured Ai. With these victories, word spread quickly among the Canaanite kings, who realized that Israel was a formidable force backed by an unstoppable God. In response, 5 Amorite kings formed a coalition to attack Gibeon, a city that had made a peace treaty with Israel. Honoring their agreement, Joshua led a surprise night march to defend Gibeon. As the battle raged, God intervened in a dramatic way. He caused confusion among the Amorite armies and sent hailstones from the sky, which killed more of the enemy than the Israelites did by sword. Then, in one of the most astonishing miracles in history, Joshua prayed for the sun to stand still so Israel could complete their victory. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down about a full day. Joshua 10:13. This divine intervention demonstrated that God was actively fighting for his people. With the southern regions secured, Joshua turned his attention to the north, where King Jabin of Hazor led another large coalition against Israel. Despite facing an overwhelming force, Joshua remained confident in God's promise. The Israelites launched a decisive attack, completely defeating the northern kings and capturing their cities. By the end of these campaigns, Israel had established control over the land. The conquest of Canaan was not just a series of battles, it was a testament to God's faithfulness. Through Joshua's leadership, Israel learned that victory came not from military strength, but from obedience to God's commands. With the major military campaigns complete, Joshua turned his focus to the next crucial task, dividing the promised land among the 12 tribes of Israel. This was not just an administrative duty. It was the fulfillment of God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Each tribe was to receive their inheritance, a tangible sign of God's faithfulness. Though many smaller battles remained, Joshua's role now shifted from warrior to a leader, ensuring that every tribe settled into the land God had given them. God instructed Joshua to distribute the land by casting lots, a method that symbolized divine guidance in the process. The tribe of Judah received a large portion in the south, while Ephraim and Manasseh, the descendants of Joseph, were granted significant territories in the central and northern regions. The remaining tribes were assigned their inheritance based on God's plan, ensuring fairness and fulfilling ancient promises. However, the Levites, who were set apart as priests, did not receive a specific region of land. Instead, they were given cities scattered throughout Israel, emphasizing that their inheritance was the Lord Himself, and their role was to serve in the tabernacle. One of the most inspiring moments during this division was when Caleb, Joshua's fellow spy from the mission to Canaan decades earlier, stepped forward to claim his inheritance. At 85 years old, Caleb showed the same faith and courage he had displayed in his youth, requesting the hill country of Hebron, which was still inhabited by the Anakim, a race of giants. "Give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day," Caleb declared, Joshua 14:12. His unwavering trust in God's promises inspired the nation, proving that faith knows no age. The division of the land was a moment of great significance. It marked the transition from wandering to settlement, from promise to possession. Yet it also carried a responsibility. The Israelites were to remain faithful to God, uphold His laws, and fully claim the land by driving out remaining enemies. Joshua had led them to this point, but their future success depended on their obedience to God. As Joshua neared the end of his life, he gathered the Israelites at Shechem for one final, powerful address. His journey from a young slave in Egypt to a victorious leader in the Promised Land had been marked by faith, obedience, and divine calling. Now, his greatest concern was not military conquest, but the spiritual future of Israel. He urged the people to remember God's faithfulness, warning them that their prosperity and security depended on their commitment to the covenant. Standing before the nation, Joshua reminded them of their history, how God had called Abraham, delivered them from Egypt, led them through the wilderness, and given them victories in Canaan. "It was not by your sword or bow," he declared, emphasizing that every success came from God alone, Joshua 24:12. Then he issued a challenge that would define his legacy. "Choose this day whom you will serve, but as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord," Joshua 24:15. The people eagerly affirmed their loyalty to God, but Joshua warned them of the seriousness of their commitment. He knew human nature, how easily people forget, grow complacent, and turn to other gods. To seal their promise, he recorded their covenant and set up a stone as a witness to their vow, ensuring future generations would remember the importance of faithfulness. Joshua died at 110 years old, and the Bible notes that during his lifetime Israel remained faithful to God. However, in the generations that followed, the people drifted away, illustrating the challenge of sustaining a legacy of faith. Joshua's story reminds us that great leaders can guide people toward God, but each individual and each generation must choose to follow Him for themselves. This lesson is just as relevant today. Like Joshua, we face battles, not against physical enemies, but against doubt, fear, and the distractions of the world. His life teaches us that true success is not measured by wealth, status, or power, but by our faithfulness to God. The question Joshua asked the Israelites is the same one we must ask ourselves daily. Who will we serve? Our choices today shape the legacy we leave behind.